Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tonic podcast. My name is Drew. I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Alex. Hello, Alex.
Hey, everybody. How goes it?
We today are going to be talking about the Saudi and Russian oil war. If you haven't kept up, a little quick synopsis is the week of like in mid-March, 313, 312, oil prices tanked. Saudi and the Russians were deciding in March 6th whether or not to actually limit the production of oil to combat the drop in demand because of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, their agreement did not work out. They ended up becoming at odds. And in order to try and claim market share, both have been pumping oil at crazy amounts into the world and the economy. And in turn has caused the oil prices to crash, sometimes up to 30% in some areas. And it's caused a big drop in the stock markets combined with the coronavirus pandemic. It has caused, one of the largest drops in the U.S. stock market in history. And it's kind of this like side story developing on the side. Of course, everyone's involved and worried about the coronavirus pandemic, which we covered earlier this week. But this is something that's kind of bubbling in the background that may have an impact on kind of the economy, the volatile economy we're seeing. So we wanted to just touch up on it, inform people, and kind of give our thoughts and opinions. Alex, what are your main thoughts about this oil war? Is this a good thing for the consumers, perhaps, or is this a bad thing in the long run?
It's a loaded question, which I don't know if I could answer directly.
It is a loaded question. You're right. I'm sorry.
But I think it's bad for the U.S. and it's probably bad for the world economy, and it's probably good for Saudi Arabia. That's how I would put this in a quick synopsis. But like my first thoughts on this are, I think this is kind of interesting because Russia and Saudi Arabia were part of a 3-year-old pact that looked to manage global oil supplies. And basically what happened is that in Vienna, Austria, Russia refused to sign on to the Saudi Arabian proposed cuts. And so this sent prices just completely spiraling. And so Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, responded by slashing oil prices. And so since then, we have seen oil at about $30 to $32 a barrel. And the problem with that is obviously cheap oil prices are good for the consumer. But there's a problem with that right now because the coronavirus, people are driving less. So people are not buying oil as much. And the second problem is countries that rely on high oil prices are going to get just hit across the head with this. So because it happened so quickly and by two of the world's biggest oil suppliers, it's going to just put complete trembles and shockwaves through the system. And I'm kind of worried to see about how this combination with the coronavirus is going to end up.
Right. It's pretty bad timing as far as sending a shock into the economic system, as we're also getting a different shock from just the complete lack of demand. I mean, you have a kind of a 20% sell-off in the market because of panic. And then I think it's going to continue to go downward because of the lack of demand. People are not going to movies. People are not going on planes. People are not going on cruises. People are staying home. So there's not much demand for things and goods anymore for a while. And this combined with the oil thing is crazy. It's going to have a huge shock on the economy. Now, I think that Saudi Arabia and Russia knew that, right? Because this is they're both playing the long game. Obviously, they're not making as much money right now off oil because they've pumped so much of it into it, the economy, that the prices have dropped. But the idea is that who can last out longer and then gain a larger market share of the world oil market. I also think that it's not just between Russia and the Saudis. We'll get into that in a bit. But basically, Russia has spent the last 5 years. This is based off of the foreign policy article on this oil war price. Russia has spent the last 5 years tightening its budget and building up $550 billion in reserves so that it can cope with the low cost of oil for up to a decade if they need to. So
Right.
Russia thinks on their side, they're prepared for this war. We can outlast it. We got money in the bank. Let's go toe to toe. Well, Saudi
Mhm.
Arabia, on the other hand, also thinks and has been saving money for this war. I think both sides think they can outlast each other, and that might be a bad combination for a long oil war.
Yeah, no. And the funny thing is, I think that's a really interesting segue into this, is that both of these countries think they can outlast each other. But this is almost the worst time for both regimes to try to outlast one another. First off, yeah, Russia believes that they are more fit to do this because in the 2000s, they rode out the oil boom. And this was because of a strong economy and huge popularity. The problem is that Vladimir Putin is not popular, and he's going to be president now, I think, until 2036 it is.
Right.
And so I find it really hard for potentially just skyfall of global oil prices and a just exploding economy. I just don't see him doing particularly well in the public eye. And first off, I don't like how they're talking in years on the Saudis, or sorry, on the Russian side, because months are what they should be talking in.
Right.
Things change so dramatically that I just think it's ridiculous to say we're prepared for 10 years. No one's prepared for 10 years.
I mean,
Yeah,
go
go
for
ahead,
it.
sorry.
No. Please finish. Please.
Okay. And also on the Saudi side, I think they are better equipped to deal with this, but I still don't think that they are the most equipped, mainly because Solomon is also having extreme problems with popularity inside of Saudi Arabia. And we've seen that when last week he was locking up members of his own family. And so I think both of these regimes are rocky at best right now. So it's going to be interesting to see them trying to outlast each other. But the
Right.
third thing I want to say is I think the main person they're trying to go after is the United States and their
Right.
shale oil market.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that is the part that I think is interesting, because the shale market is controversial, but it is also different. And I actually think it could ride out both of these better than Russia or Saudi Arabia could.
Yes, I mean, so that was my kind of other elephant in the room was the United States, right? The United States in the last 6 years has gone from an oil buyer to an oil seller.
Right.
The shale oil industry has boomed so much that we, the United States, are now the largest holder of oil reserves. That's a big That's a big power play against nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia, who before then were the top two dogs, and then Venezuela is behind them. Speaking of, Venezuela is going to probably crash even harder after this. Their
Yes,
economy is already
yes,
in the tanks,
definitely.
and now it's going to be completely in shambles. So Venezuela's been pushed out. It's not even a competitive player anymore. The United States is now the top dog. And Saudi Arabia and Russia both want to recapture that market share. Now they tried this against shale oil in 2014 and 2015. Saudis did this oil pump to crash adversaries, and it did bankrupt some shale oil firms in the United States. But I also think the shale oil industry in the United States has survived that, and are now more prepared for it. And I don't think it's going to work this time. And it didn't work last time because we're still now the top dog. So it's a tactic that Saudi has tried to use against us before, and it didn't have a lasting impact other than a few short-term bankruptcies. But that's kind of the other thing too, is we're on the sidelines. They're trying to also steal market share from us, but I think we're better prepared for it. I honestly think that Saudi Arabia, take the two leaders, right? Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is like half the age of Vladimir Putin and probably has less than half the experience in dealing with these kind of toe-to-toe foreign policy battles. I think Vladimir Putin is a lot more well-equipped as far as his intelligence and wisdom in this area to go head-to-head against Saudi Arabia. It's a risky move from Mohammed bin Salman. And on top of that, it's a risky move because Mohammed bin Salman has been trying this. He has a vision for Saudi Arabia that he's been pushing, that he's trying to get away from this, Dutch economy where it's all based off one thing. He wants to transform Saudi Arabia into a modernized, diversified economy with a high standard of living that rivals that of Western countries. It's called the Saudi Vision 2030. I was perusing their website. Again, it was translated into English. I was perusing their website about it. I mean, he has pretty big big ideas. You know, he wants 60% of Saudi families to have home ownership. He wants the standard of living, you know, to be comparable to Western countries. He wants to build cultural centers, operas, like opera houses. You know, he has this big idea, and 2030 is not that far away. He has 1 decade to do it on his promise, and now in the beginning of the decade, he goes to an oil war at the time of a pandemic with two of the biggest players in oil. It's really risky, and I don't know if he's going to be able to complete his vision by the time frame he wants if he's also engaging in this oil war.
So I want to address a couple things you said first. So first I want to go back to Russia and Saudi Arabia, and I think you're very correct. Vladimir Putin, you can say a lot of things about him, but the man is a strategic whiz. And you're right, Salman is younger, less experienced, and I think he's having issues with actually finding what his true identity is. One day he wants to be open and progressive, and the next day he wants to lock up everyone who disagrees with him, and he kills journalists in Turkey. So obviously, I think he's having a bit of an identity crisis. We could call it a midlife crisis or something. I don't know. But the thing is, I think Putin's plan is different than what most of the people think it is. And foreign policy had a good point, and I was thinking about this, and I really think it's probably the correct one on this, is that Russia and Putin are doing this because they want to undermine the U.S. in a very crucial international coercive force we use, which are sanctions. I think because the U.S. has been one of, like you said, the largest supplier of oil over the last decade or so, we've had a lot of power around the world in Russian sanctions and a lot of other questionable activity that Putin's been involved in. Obviously, every time he moves into, say, Crimea, there's sanctions.
Right.
But by wielding power away from U.S. shale producers and driving the prices down, this basically inflicts economic harm on the United States, and it undermines our ability to do economic sanctions on Russia. So the thing is that I think Russia could outlive this crisis in some ways because they have different motives. I don't think the motives are completely to dominate the oil economy. I think they're to undermine the United States so they can do other things that are outside of this economic sphere. Yeah. And I'm curious to see how that goes. But it is true that we would have a lot less might in our sanction power, especially linked to energy reserves, if things changed. And I just wanted to make it known that shale producers are, they're not the same apparatus as they are, say, an oil company inside of Saudi Arabia or in Russia, where they are state financed and controlled.
Right.
In the United States, these are private companies that go by the sways of the market. And so they could be either more successful or completely humiliated, depending on how this goes. So maybe in the long run, this could benefit Russia. But the other side of it is that I don't think that what Saudi Arabia is doing is going for this 2030 plan you're talking about, because there's a lot of identity issues they need to solve. But on a pure oil war and price war, I think Saudi Arabia has the upper hand. And it's not because of leadership, and it's not because of trying to democratize the country, but it's because by raising exports, and this is from Foreign Policy's article as well, but it says in quotes, by raising exports from 7+ million barrels a day to 9+ million barrels a day, or even more, Saudi Arabia can make the same amount of money as it would have in a world without Russian cooperation. And because their economy is so robustly built around oil, this is not going to be a net loss for the kingdom. And so I think there's multiple levels to this. Like I think Russia is doing this because of kind of an FU and a middle finger to the United States in a way to get more political power. And I think Saudi Arabia is taking advantage of this as a way to just continue their own internal issues with Russia and maybe bring in revenue so they can start democratizing the country. I don't know what your thoughts on that, but that's kind of my grand theory, I guess you could say.
Yeah, well, I mean, Putin definitely does play the long game and is known to do that for a long time. Like, Russia's foreign policy outlook is one of a long-term destabilization of the West and a coalescence around, Russian power, right? This is so it could definitely play into all of that. I honestly think Russia's better prepared than Saudi Arabia just because of the lack of experience with this leader, Mohammed bin Salman. Yes,
Mhm.
they have billions of barrels of oil reserves, but again, if I think if they don't diversify his economy, it could be really bad if they lose this war. And again, we talked about how both sides think the other's going to quit soon, and both aren't going to quit soon. So I just don't think that. I just don't think. I think that if it turns into long term, Saudi Arabia is at a worse position than Russia. I also
If
think, I also think that the fact that Saudi Arabia is also trying to also chip away at American share of the oil industry, right, is a sign that you know we're not exactly buddy buddy with Saudi Arabia. We're really buddy buddy with Saudi Arabia when we want to be, but in reality, I mean, especially in political theory, we're completely different, forms of government and pretty much completely different worldviews and ideologies. And our relationship with Saudi Arabia is one only of economics, and maybe even a little bit of Middle Eastern influence. But the British statesman Lord Palmerston famously opined that nations don't have permanent allies, only interests, and the Saudis certainly behave in that way, pursuing their interests to the exclusion of friends and enemies alike. And I think this oil war is a great example of that. They are willing to literally just burn bridges if it means they can seize on more market share of the oil industry, and for their own interests. Time and time and again, I always wonder why we are so we would do so much work with Saudi Arabia when they're so obviously just in their own interest all the time.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
and I get that most nations operate most nations operate out of their own interests, but still, like, Western democracies have sacrificed things for each other in the pursuit of maintaining democracy. Saudi Arabia is not even close to that kind of relationship. It's solely about their own interests and the kingdom of Saudi Arabia in particular.
hmm hmm Yeah. So first, I think you're right that this Russia Saudi Arabian holdout is going to be longer than we expect, and it reminds me of a quote that was in the policy that said, in quotes, "It reminds me of the First World War when France and Germany went to war thinking they'd be home by Christmas and spent 4 years in the trenches. That's why this is so dangerous. It's a mirror image."
Hmm.
And so I just wanted to get that quote out there while the topic was still relevant, because I think it is interesting to see that these are these two that think just a simple not trade war, oil war can be won in the short term. No, probably not. But second off, I think you have a point, is that the leadership inside of Saudi Arabia is not the most stable at the moment, as we've seen with internal family dynamics that seem toxic for potentially a democratic state. Uh, and you're right, they're not our friend, but I think this whole issue goes more towards Russia and Saudi Arabia mainly having an agreement over controlling oil prices, but realizing that the U.S. as a growing shale producer kind of offset that to a certain extent. And so I think for different reasons, both of them have done what they've done. Um, Obviously, the long term, we'll see how resilient the shale industry is, and we'll see how the world economy and voters at home do with both of them. But and then on to the part you have about Saudi Arabia and why we're friends with them. It's true. I guess, to be devil's advocate, I think it's the fact that this kingdom is in a part of the world where resources are not exactly, plentiful except for oil. And then you also get a very, tribalistic culture that over time, um, found itself around a very conservative vision of Islam. I think you kind of get a closed society that also is resource heavy in oil. So it's kind of a Dutch disease, but mixed with ideology.
Yeah.
And they're down to sell whatever they have, but they're not really down to export friendship. And and I think it's something that most of us have been fine with. And when I say most of us, I don't mean you and I, the U.S. government, British government, whoever else. It's
Right.
something we're down to accept because we have to. But I think we've been slowly reanalyzing our relationship with them as shale prices have gone up, and so that's why I've always been a proponent of shale. I know there's a lot of controversy around fracking. I know there is. But I've always thought that making Americans not dependent on Saudi oil is a nice thing. And something interesting out of The Economist, it was called large parts of Africa and the Middle East are hostage to oil prices. And it was actually talking about the ramifications of what Saudi Arabia is doing, because you were talking about this 2030 plan. It's not going to happen because no one's going to like them if them and Russia hold this together. And in my opinion, one of the main aspirations that need to be completed to be part of the democratic world, to be part of an open and vibrant society, you need to have friends and other countries you work with. And just a few countries that are going to get impacted. Nigeria, oil accounts for 90% of their exports and 2/3 of their government revenue.
Wow.
Their budget is based on oil. Yeah, so their budget is based on oil, which is at $57 a barrel. They're going to have to put in extreme austerity programs, and they have the largest rising population in the world. Oman, their 2020 budget predicted a deficit of 8% of GDP, and that was with $58 a barrel.
Jeez.
With prices at $30 a barrel, they could see deficit as high as 22%. Bahrain relies on oil for around 75% of their public revenue. They have already cut spending and have to borrow after 2014 when years of $100 prices came to an end. Yeah. So imagine what's going to happen when prices again have almost been cut in half. Iraq, a collapsing state with government paralysis and conflict. They also rely on funding for revenue at 90%. So what happens when all of these countries mentioned and many more, basically SH hits the fan?
It's like that famous quote, the famous quote where it's like a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, a receding tide, beaches all boats. And it seems like that's going to be happening, right? Like Saudi Arabia and Russia may have saved up billions in preparation for a war or the potential for a war, but Oman hasn't, Nigeria hasn't. Speaking to that, right, if you have these massive austerity measures or the requirement to take loans out for these countries to stay stable, guess if I was China, I would jump at the opportunity. Hey, Oman, we'll pay for the rest of your budget. We just got to help us with Belt and Road down the line. This could open up opportunities for other countries to gain influence in areas where maybe there wasn't the opportunity before, thanks to the crashing oil prices. That's really interesting you bring up those African countries. And again, people are going to suffer from this. And I don't think Saudi Arabia particularly cares because, again, they act out of their own interests. But, yeah, that's crazy that you bring up how many other states in Africa and the Middle East are dependent on oil. We mentioned it earlier in the episode. Venezuela is probably going to tank even farther than they have before the last few years because of all this. I guess who benefits from this? Companies that utilize oil. Not like any of us are going to be taking a cruise soon, but like airlines, cruises, trucking industries are probably going to benefit from this because the oil will be cheaper to use. But I think overall the economic effect will be negative overall.
Well, right. And yes, cruise ships could benefit from it, but the problem is no one's going on cruises and no one's taking flights. So increasing supply at a time of falling demand
doesn't mean much.
It's just insane.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm really curious about the long term. I know Russia says they're prepared for the long term and they can withstand this for 10 to 15 years, but why? That's my question to them is why? What is the point? Because, obviously, if you think about it, I think it was 2036 is when now Putin's going to be hopefully done. Obviously, 10 to 15 years is when Putin's gone. Is this just to just to keep the oil prices with Putin or what? I don't get it. But yeah, but I just don't understand this at the end of the day because, back to that Saudi 2030 thing that you were talking about, which is quite fascinating. Like, I don't know about you, but like I've already said, I think to be an actual open democracy, you need to have friends and you need to have other countries that you share some similarities with when it comes to, coming to the table and having a discussion or someone you can count on.
No, I agree.
And how are you going to tell other countries, oh, yeah, we're an open democracy that, we're open for business. But, 10 years ago, we completely destroyed your country and caused inflation to completely just ravage the system.
Right, and how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for this 2030 vision? If you're talking about, building opera halls and getting a home for 60% of Saudi families and minimizing the gap between the rich and the poor, yeah, you got to pay for that stuff. And your original plan was to pay for it through oil money, and now you're not going to have that. That's exactly what happened to Venezuela. When Venezuela's oil prices were good and they were getting billions of dollars of oil money, they were able to pay for opticians for people, put up medical clinics. Everyone in Venezuela had access to a doctor. It looked great. I mean, oh my God, it's a socialist revolution. But as soon as that oil prices fell, so did all the other things, like a stack of dominoes. And I just think that I understand his vision. I understand that, like, Mohammed bin Salman understands that he can't prop up his society just off of oil money. That's why he's doing this vision to diversify and change it. But you still have to have that transitional period. And when you're at the beginning of a transitional period facing an oil war, that's just not looking good for his vision at all. I think you're right. He's burning bridges. He's threatening economies, and he doesn't have very many friends.
Not at all. Not at all. And I think you touched on earlier, and I wish I answered to it when you did. China, you'd mentioned that before, and I think it's a very valid point, is that, again, this is where China's going to pick up the pieces.
Right.
And this is even more interesting to me because Russia is almost going out of character with this, because Russia and China are amigos. But if Russia keeps going down this path, maybe there's a third option. There's kind of been the U.S., the Russians, and maybe China's now just becoming the third option now instead. And it's true. You have extreme debt, hyperinflation. Sure, we'll help you out. And unfortunately, I could imagine that Saudi Arabia does not, match up with China when it comes to ideology, motives, futuristic views. No. But they're almost allowing them to pave this way, and it's just something so disgusting to me in this part of the world. But I think it answers to the end of the day. You don't want a nation that's reliant on one resource.
Never.
I mean, that's what we've seen with Saudi Arabia. They're lucky because their population is kind of put into a place where the royal family runs it, and they have all the money, and they have a limited amount of actual working people. They import a lot of their labor, so it's a little bit different. But a Venezuela and a Russia, you don't want to be relying on oil. And luckily, Russia, I think that's why they can afford this, is because they have other industry.
Right. I mean, yeah.
I don't know. It's just interesting to see, again, this Dutch disease, which is the idea of a country that is rich in one resource that are exploited. Yeah. And I wouldn't say that Saudi Arabia is exploited for it, but in some way it is a curse, because their whole political livelihood, kind of relies on oil, which is not a good model.
No, I mean, you're right that they've been effective in coalescing. They have, Saudi Arabia is kind of the de facto leader of the OPEC group of oil providers, right? So they've coalesced and tried their best not to be the exploited, but instead be the exploitative. And so they've maneuvered themselves in the way that they have all this power. But I think Mohammed bin Salman is playing with fire, because, again, like the United States, like, we've been buddy with Saudi Arabia for years. But as we get more shale oil and become more energy independent from them, we don't need them as much. I mean, we've already talked about it, but Saudi Arabia has friends like drug dealers have friends. Like, oh yeah, I know all these people, man. They all come to my house every day. Like, yeah, because you have weed. And if you don't have weed, they're not your friends anymore. And I think that's exactly where Saudi Arabia is at. And I think that this is a risky gamble that's gonna be negative in the long run. Even if they think that they're prepared, I think it's just gonna force other nations to go to different sources. I mean, the United States, of course, has been doing that. And we already talked about it, that if there's issues with funding and budgeting, other nations like China, I'm sure, will be more than willing to make up the difference and gain some more influence in parts of the world like Africa.
Yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree. I mean, I liked your point, because I think it's true. It's like if all of a sudden someone's drug dealer all of a sudden wants to now be starting a new society. You're like, okay, let's take this one step at a time.
Yeah, hold on, man. Like, just give me the weed.
Yeah, you're good at what you do, but I don't really know if I want you to start a Saudi Arabia 2030 either.
Yeah, join my commune, man. Like, I'm good, dog. I'm good.
No, and But like the other thing is, and I think it's the elephant in the room back to the shale industry, is I think the United States right now, during an extreme hyper divisive culture and a coronavirus outbreak, I think somehow the United States needs to keep powering ahead with our shale. And this has been a very resilient industry. But this is one of my questions I have for you, is that do you think the shale industry can last because of, for example, the environmentalism that's come out in the United States? You know, a Green New Deal and all these ideas, where I don't know if a shale industry is really parallel to where a lot of, especially progressives, want to go, but I almost feel like a shale industry is necessary.
Well, look, if the question is, do I think the United States should be, if I think the United States should be energy independent from players like Saudi Arabia, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, it has been shale helping us do that. I would argue that I do think that there's environmental concerns with shale. I think that our government hasn't done enough in alternate options. Right, Trump has not been promoting green energies at all. In fact, he's been cutting budgets to green energies and giving more subsidies to oil companies. So I think there's an imbalance in what we're investing in as a nation as an alternate energy. I think that this next election, is going to be a big teller of where the shale industry goes. If you have Trump reelected, shale industry, I think, will survive. Even if you just have a moderate like Joe Biden. He's going to be pushing greener options, just because that's where I think the Democratic Party, progressive or moderate, is more green options, alternate energies, solar, wind, whatever. I think they're going to be pushed more, and fracking is not popular among Democrats. So this election, I think, will be a big determining factor in how our shale industry does in the next 4 to 8 years.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, interestingly enough, Joe Biden is obviously not, super fossil fuels guy, but he hasn't spoken out too much against fracking, mainly because places that he needs to win, such as Pennsylvania, for example, are quite heavily dependent on it. And so I personally, it's another reason why I say Biden is probably the best one I would vote for. Just because I'm with you, where I think we need to start elevating our green options. But we also need to keep somewhat of an insurance package, because at the end of the day, these other countries are still doing it. But it'd be nicer to know that there is some interdependence in the United States on this. And I think that's one of the powers of the United States, if we can manifest it right and utilize it, is the fact that the strength we've always had is diversified.
Right.
And so why don't we have more green energy mixed with still some fracking? Because I just don't think we're at the point where we can totally ditch it yet, because it would be astronomically. And I think that's the issue I have with a person like Bernie, because I don't know if he'd be willing to, because he said he wants to get rid of most fracking. And you have to wonder if that's exactly what Putin would want.
True. I mean, that would be certainly a change, and I think that that's one of my concerns with Bernie is there's not a lot of nuance as far as transitional periods. I think you would need a transitional period. You can't just say, "Oh, fracking's banned," because you would have a pretty bad economic collapse after that, or at least a beginning of another recession. And again, like you said, Saudi Arabia and Russia would be delighted. But I also think that we can't shale frack forever. And so there has to be a kind of a transitional period, and again, I think it's going to depend on the next election. But I do believe that it's important to stay energy independent, so that we don't have to rely on basically drug dealers like Saudi Arabia.
I think that's one of the best analogies you've had. Is the drug dealer one, because it is so true, and like sparks just went in my head when you said that. I mean, it's just such an accurate point, is that it's not a country, much like a drug dealer. It's not someone you actually want to work with.
No,
but
you don't want to hang out with them.
But they have what you want at the time, and you're down to be cool with them for 20 minutes.
Yep.
That's about as much as it takes. So no, I think that's a good point. And I'm just curious to see how long these two ride it out. Because obviously I think coronavirus is going to get worse before it gets better. And this situation also sounds like it's going to get worse before it gets better. So it's like, what the hell is going to happen?
Yeah, I really hope it's not the two straws that break the camel's back. We already have one straw that almost broke the camel's back, and now we feel like we're adding another. So All right. Well, we'll have to see what happens. Pretty interesting times. An interesting foreign policy battle between Russia and Saudi Arabia that also includes the United States. So we'll see how it goes. But I guess kind of a positive turn at the end is I might get gas cheaper here in California. Maybe I'll get below $4 a gallon or something.
Potentially, you never know.
Potentially, because gas
if you
pretty
can
high.
leave your house soon.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
Yeah, I'm not driving anywhere, but at least gas is cheap. All right, folks. Thank you again for tuning in to Tonic Accord. Any last words, Alex, before we head out of here?
Not much. Check us out: YouTube, Podbean, iTunes. I guess Facebook if you want to, if that's your thing. Third-party sites. Please let us know what you think. It's been fun. I've really enjoyed this process, and we're always working to improve. But how do we improve unless you guys tell us? Tell us stuff. Tell us anything. Tell us how bad it was. Tell us how great it was. Just keep telling us stuff, and we're just going to work to improve it. It's been fun, and have a great week. And I hope we'll see you guys next week, as long as stuff doesn't really hit the fan. I don't know.
All right. Thank you, Alex. He said it best. Stay safe, wash those hands, and we'll tune in next week.